October 1966, Durango, Mexico. A film set in the middle of the desert. John Wayne pointed at Dean Martin across a crowded lunch table. 43 crew members went silent. Wayne's voice carried across the desert. "You," he said. "You're a coward." Dean Martin didn't move, didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at John Wayne. The silence lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds where nobody breathed, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then Dean Martin said 4 words that made John Wayne sit back down. 4 words that the 43 people at that table never forgot for the rest of their lives. For 31 years, nobody outside that desert knew what those 4 words were. John Wayne never repeated them publicly. Dean Martin never mentioned them. The crew members who heard it stayed silent until 1997, 2 years after Dean Martin died, when one crew member finally decided the world needed to know. Durango, Mexico in October 1966 was not a comfortable place to make a movie. The desert heat during the day was punishing. The nights dropped cold. The terrain was unforgiving. Dust got into everything. Equipment. Food. Eyes. The kind of place that stripped away pretense and left people raw. 2 film productions were working in the same general area that month. John Wayne was shooting The War Wagon with Kirk Douglas. Big budget, major western, Wayne in his element. Dean Martin was nearby filming The Ambushers, a Matt Helm spy comedy. Lighter material, different energy entirely. Different world. The productions had separate crews, separate schedules, separate everything. But the desert doesn't respect studio boundaries. The lunch areas overlapped. The paths crossed. People from both productions ended up at the same tables. The same food. The same shade dust. For 3 weeks, the 2 worlds had coexisted without incident. Professional courtesy. Hollywood protocol. 2 stars from different universes acknowledging each other from a distance, nodding. Moving on, the crew members mixed more freely, talked, shared stories, compared notes about their respective stars. That's how information traveled. That's how the stunt story got from one production to the other. 3 days before that lunch, a stunt coordinator on The Ambushers had asked Dean to perform a riding sequence without a double. A basic scene, horse at a trot. Nothing dangerous, but Dan had refused, politely, firmly. He didn't do stunts, had never done stunts, wasn't going to start now. The coordinator, frustrated, mentioned it to someone from the other production. That someone mentioned it to Wayne. And Wayne, who had broken multiple bones doing his own work over 30 years of filmmaking, who had never once asked for a double, who considered performing your own physical work a baseline requirement of professional integrity. Wayne stored it, filed it, let it sit. Until that lunch table. John Wayne was born Marion Robert Morrison in 1907, changed his name, built a persona so complete that most people forgot it was a persona. On screen he was the archetypal American man. Hard, direct, unafraid. Off-screen he was remarkably similar. He genuinely believed in the values his characters represented. Hard work, physical courage, pushing through pain, never asking for help you didn't need. He did every stunt himself, not for show, not for publicity, because he believed that was the right way to do the job. Broken ribs in 1950, kept working. Shoulder injury in 1955, kept working. A fall from a horse in 1962 that would have hospitalized most people. Wayne was back on set the next morning. His body was a record of his philosophy. Scars and old fractures and joints that never healed quite right. He wore them like credentials. When he saw someone avoid physical risk, he took it personally. Not as a professional judgment, but as a moral one. Softness offended him. Deeply, genuinely. This wasn't performance, this was belief. Dean Martin was born Dino Crossetti in 1917 in Steubenville, Ohio. Also changed his name, also built a persona, but a completely different one. Where Wayne was granite, Dean was water. Where Wayne was effort, Dean was ease. Where Wayne pushed through everything, Dunn moved around obstacles he didn't need to engage with. The martini in hand, the half-closed eyes, the smile that suggested nothing was serious enough to worry about. Dean didn't do stunts, not because he was afraid, because he saw no reason to. There were professionals who did that work. Let them do it. That was their expertise. His expertise was elsewhere. He had no interest in proving anything to anyone, had spent 30 years building a life on exactly that principle. These two men should never have been in the same desert. They represented opposing philosophies of what it meant to be a man in America, what it meant to work, what it meant to be strong. They were bound to collide eventually. The desert just provided the setting. The theories started almost immediately, not publicly, not yet, but among the 43 crew members who'd been at that table. Whispers, speculation. What exactly had happened? What had Dunn said? What were those 4 words? The crew members went back to their respective productions. Told people. Those people told people. The story spread through the film industry the way all film industry stories spread. Fast, distorted, elaborated. Theory 1 said Dean threatened Wayne physically. This was the most dramatic version. Dean had risen from his seat and threatened to have Wayne hurt. Had connections, had resources, had people who could make things unpleasant. Growing up in Steubenville, knowing the people he knew in Las Vegas, Den had access to a different kind of power. A stagehand who'd been on the periphery told people in a bar in Los Angeles 6 months later. Dean Martin stood up and told Wayne he'd regret it. Not directly, but the message was clear. Wayne backed down because he understood what backing down meant. Theory 2 said Dean simply left, walked away from the desert entirely, quit the ambushers, had his people call the studio, told them he was done, went back to Los Angeles, left Wayne sitting at that table talking to empty air. A production assistant from another project heard this version. Martin left Mexico that same day, packed his trailer and drove to the airport, never finished the film. Not true. Dean completed the ambushers. Every schedule. But the story spread anyway. Theory 3 said it was a joke. Dean had diffused the entire situation with a single line. Something witty. Something that made the 43 crew members laugh. That made Wayne himself laugh despite trying not to. That turned the confrontation into comedy. Someone who worked in the studio mailroom, Dean Martin, made a joke and everyone cracked up. Even Wayne. That was Dean's superpower. He could make anything funny. Theory 4 said Dean called Wayne a coward right back. Met aggression with aggression. Pointed across the table and said, "Look who's talking." Or something stronger. Something that put Wayne on the defensive, made it a fair fight. A camera operator mentioned this version to his wife. I heard Martin gave it right back to Wayne. Told him something about why Wayne had stayed out of the war. Something personal. Wayne had no answer for it, but Theory 5 said the confrontation didn't end at the table. Dean had laughed it off in public, smiled, changed the subject, but had approached Wayne privately afterward. In Wayne's trailer. Had a very different conversation where no one was watching. Had said things he couldn't say in front of 43 people. A makeup artist heard this version. Dean let it go in the moment. But that night he went to Wayne's trailer. They were in there for an hour. Nobody knows what was said, but Wayne was different after. Theory 6 involved Kirk Douglas. According to this version, Douglas had intervened. Stepped between the two men before Dean could respond. Said something that redirected Wayne's anger. Smoothed everything over. Used his particular brand of Hollywood diplomacy to prevent it escalating. A script supervisor. Kirk Douglas stopped it. He said something to Wayne about respecting different approaches to the work. Wayne respected Kirk. That's why it ended. Theory 7 was darker. Crueler. Some crew members expected Dean to crumble. To get emotional. To show something they'd never seen from the King of Cool. The theory wasn't that Dean fought back. It was that he couldn't. That Wayne's accusation hit something real. Something vulnerable. And Dean had sat there and taken it. Head down. unable to respond, destroyed publicly by a man he couldn't match, a grip who hadn't been at the table but heard about it secondhand. They say Martin just sat there, couldn't say a word. Wayne completely broke him. Theory 8 was the most elaborate. Dean had said something so psychologically precise, so perfectly aimed at Wayne's specific insecurities, that the response hadn't just deflected the attack, it had humiliated Wayne completely, left him speechless and exposed. A screenwriter who heard the story in 1967. Whatever done, Martin said, it cut Wayne to the bone. Something about the stunts, about what they represented, something Wayne had never considered and couldn't argue with. All wrong. Every single theory. Wrong. The truth was simpler, more elegant, more devastating than anything anyone imagined. Nobody knew what those 4 words were. Not the people who spread the theories. Not the Hollywood journalists who tried to investigate. Not the biographers who researched both men for years. The desert kept its secret. Now, you might think this was just 2 Hollywood stars having an argument in the Mexican desert, egos clashing, testosterone competing, the kind of thing that happened on film sets every day. Stars disagreeing, personalities colliding, grown men behaving like the characters they played on screen. But here's what makes this different. John Wayne was the toughest man in Hollywood. Literally. Not the toughest character he played on screen. The man himself, he did his own stunts, every single one, in every single film. He broke bones and kept working. He pushed through pain that would have stopped anyone else. His body at 60 was a catalog of old injuries, healed wrong, never fully healed. Proof of 30 years of refusing to let anyone else take his risks. When John Wayne called you a coward, it meant something. It came from a specific place, a specific set of values he'd lived completely. And Dean Martin knew exactly who he was talking to. Dean had faced tough men before, real ones. He'd grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, surrounded by men for whom violence was a professional tool. He'd spent decades navigating the mob-controlled entertainment industry of Las Vegas. He'd sat at tables with men who made people disappear. He'd been in rooms where the wrong word could end careers or something worse. He'd dealt with real danger, real power, real consequence. And yet when John Wayne, the Duke, the symbol of American toughness, pointed across a table and said the word coward, Dean Martin didn't reach for a weapon, didn't raise his voice, didn't stand up. He just looked at him for 11 seconds. And what he did next nobody saw coming. Nobody knew what those 4 words were. Not for 31 years. The witnesses carried it privately, all of them, for decades. A camera operator from the Wayne production who'd wandered over to the shared lunch area that day tried to describe it in 1973. He was at a party. Someone asked about the most memorable moment he'd ever seen on a film set. He started to answer. Stopped himself. There's one, but I can't tell it. Both men are still alive. He changed the subject, never told it. Not then. A set decorator from the Ambushers kept a journal, standard practice for some crew members, logging the days, the weather, the work, the incidents. The October entry referenced the lunch table, referenced Wayne, referenced Dean, but where the 4 words should have been, she'd written only. DM responded, said 4 words. I'll never forget them. Not writing them here. Too important to risk. She was asked about it in 1982 by a journalist researching a Don Martin biography. Showed him the journal. Let him read the entry. Wouldn't tell him what the words were. Both of them are gone, she said. Not before. Kirk Douglas was asked about it directly in 1978. A reporter doing a piece on the war wagon mentioned the lunch table incident. Asked what he remembered. Douglas looked at the reporter for a long moment. I don't discuss other people's private moments. That's between them. He never elaborated, never denied it happened, never confirmed details. Just that one sentence and closed the subject. A Hollywood journalist who'd been working the industry since the 1950s wrote about it in 1980. Not in a major publication, in a small trade newsletter. Here is a story from Durango, Mexico, in October 1966 involving Wayne and Martin that everyone in the industry seems to have heard fragments of and nobody will confirm. I've asked 6 people directly. Each one knows something. None will speak on record. That usually means the story is not only true but significant. Nobody knew what had been said. The story existed as rumor, as fragment, as suggestion, verified by silence rather than disclosure. Then in 1974, John Wayne gave an interview about the toughest men he'd ever known in Hollywood. The interviewer had a list, went through names. Wayne rated them. Some he dismissed. Some he respected. Then the interviewer said Dean Martin's name. Wayne went quiet for a moment. The interviewer laughed slightly. Assumed Wayne would dismiss him. Wayne didn't laugh. Dean Martin is a lot tougher than people think, Wayne said. I learned that. The interviewer tried to follow up. Wayne had already moved on to the next name. But those words, that pause, the absence of a laugh, people who heard the interview noticed, filed it away, added it to the growing mystery. By the mid-1980s, Dunn was asked about Wayne occasionally. Usually in the context of comparing Hollywood tough guys, Dean would deflect, change the subject, make a joke. Once, just once, in 1990, a friend asked him directly about Durango, about the lunch table. The friend had heard a version of the story, wanted to know if it was true. Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. That particular smile he had, the one that meant something was private and staying that way. Something happened there that I'm proud of, he said. That's all? The friend pushed. Just a little. What were the 4 words? Dean picked up his drink. Buy me a better drink and I'll think about it. He never said them. Not to that friend. Not to anyone who asked. Not publicly. Not privately on record. Nobody knew. The words stayed buried in the Mexican desert for 3 more decades. If someone like John Wayne called you a coward in front of 40 people, what would you have done? Would you have defended yourself? Fought back? Proven him wrong with words or action? Would you have listed your accomplishments, your courage, your history? Explained yourself? Justified yourself? Or walked away to preserve what dignity remained? Or could you have done what Dean Martin did, agreed completely and said nothing more? November 1997. 2 years after Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, a retired film crew member named Gerald Sauce gave an interview to a small Hollywood trade publication called The Grip. He was 71 years old. He'd worked in film production for 35 years, had been at that lunch table in Durango, 6 feet from Dean Martin, had heard every word from both men. He'd kept the story for 31 years, said he'd made a personal decision when he walked away from table in 1966. He'd keep it until both men were gone. Respect, not secrecy. Just respect. And died in December 1995. Wayne had died in 1979. By 1997, Sauce decided the world had waited long enough. The interview was modest. The publication was small. Circulation in the hundreds. But one person who read it mentioned it online. Then another. Then a larger publication picked it up. Then another. Within 3 months, what Gerald Sauce told The Grip had reached every major entertainment publication in America. And the 31-year mystery was finally over. I was sitting 6 feet from Dean Martin when Wayne said it. Sauce told the interviewer. I heard every word. From both of them. I've wanted to tell this story for 30 years. I'm telling it now because these men deserve to be understood correctly. Both of them. He described the setting, the desert heat, the dust, the 43 people at that shared lunch table. The moment Wayne's voice cut across the noise, the silence that fell. Then what Dean said. The publication ran it. 6 words in the headline. 4 of them Dean's. Wayne's accusation had been building for 3 days. It wasn't impulsive. It was considered. Wayne had thought about it, had decided it needed to be said publicly. Because in his value system, cowardice tolerated was cowardice condoned. He sat at that table and he pointed and he said it. You won't ride a horse without someone holding your hand. You call that being a man. I call that being a coward. You're soft, Martin. You always were. 43 people waited. The desert waited. The silence was physical. Something you could feel pressing against your skin. Dean put down his fork. The sound of it against the plate was audible in the silence. He looked at Wayne. No anger in his face. No performance. No smile. No preparation. He just looked. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the 4 words. Clat, flat, final. I know I am. No defense. No counter-attack. No explanation. No attempt to save face. No justification. No listing of credentials. No reaching for dignity. Complete, total, immediate agreement. And somehow those 4 words destroyed Wayne's attack more completely than any comeback could have. Because you cannot fight a man who agrees with you. Wayne opened his mouth, closed it. The sentence he'd prepared, the follow-up, the reinforcement, the escalation, had nowhere to go. The target had stepped aside. The punch had hit air. He sat back. The 43 crew members looked at their food. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Gerald Sauce, sitting 6 feet away, told the grip. I've thought about that moment for 30 years. I've described it to my wife, my kids, my friends, and I always struggle to explain why it was so powerful. The best I can do is this. Wayne called Dean a coward and Dean said yes. And somehow in that yes, Dean was the strongest man at that table. Dean Martin had been hearing versions of that accusation his entire life. It started in Steubenville. Too Italian, too soft, too different. The immigrant kid who didn't fit, who didn't speak English right, who didn't look like what they expected. He'd heard it from jazz purists when his voice was called too smooth, too commercial, too easy. He'd heard it from serious actors when he did comedy with Jerry Lewis. Wasting his talent, taking the easy path, refusing real work. He'd heard it from everyone when the Lewis partnership ended. He'll never make it alone. Needs Jerry. Can't carry a project. Can't be the star. Too dependent. Too limited. Too soft. He'd heard it from people in Vegas when he didn't engage in the competitive posturing that men in that world used to establish hierarchy. Doesn't fight for his position. Doesn't defend his turf. Doesn't understand how this works. Soft. For 25 years, Dean Martin had been hearing variations of what John Wayne said at that lunch table. And somewhere along the way, not in a single moment, not as a decision, but gradually, through accumulation and time and clarity, he'd stopped arguing with it. Not because it was true, but because he'd understood something profound about insults and the power they hold. An insult only has power if the person receiving it believes it matters. If you defend yourself against it, you've acknowledged that it has the ability to diminish you. You've given it authority. But if you agree with it, if you own it completely, something different happens. The insult has nothing to attach to. It's like throwing a punch at water. The water doesn't fight back, it just moves, absorbs, continues. Growing up Italian in Ohio had taught Din this first. You could fight every name they called you, spend your whole life exhausted by other people's judgments. Or you could carry your identity so completely, so thoroughly, so without apology, that the names couldn't find purchase. His early career had reinforced it. Every criticism about his voice, his style, his choice of material. He could have spent his energy defending his choices, explaining himself, justifying. Instead, he kept recording, kept performing. Let the work answer. The Jerry Lewis years had been the crucible. Jerry was undeniably the more obviously talented half of the act. Funnier, more physical, more chaotic, more demanding of attention. Dean was called the straight man, the supporting player, the handsome guy who stood there while the real talent worked. He could have fought that, insisted on being seen differently. He didn't. He played the role they gave him so well, so completely, that when the partnership ended and Dean went solo, he was more grounded than anyone expected. He'd been comfortable being underestimated for so long that being underestimated couldn't hurt him. By October 1966, when John Wayne pointed across that lunch table, Dean Martin had 25 years of practice. 25 years of agreeing with the room and proceeding anyway. "I know I am" wasn't a strategy he'd devised. It was just the truth he'd been living. He was a man who didn't do his own stunts, didn't pretend to, didn't apologize for it, didn't need to defend it. That was real. Agreeing with it cost him nothing, because he'd already made peace with it long before Wayne opened his mouth. John Wayne spent the rest of his life slightly unsettled by Dean Martin. Not obsessively, not dramatically, but the Durango moment stayed with him, filed itself somewhere that occasionally surfaced. In 1968, talking to a director between shots, they were discussing cast for an upcoming project. Dean's name came up. The director made a dismissive comment. Wayne stopped him. "Don't underestimate Martin. He surprised me once. Really surprised me." He didn't explain. The director assumed it was something about Dean's acting. Moved on. In 1971, a journalist interviewing Wayne about Hollywood masculinity, about the men he respected, about what real toughness looked like. Wayne went through names, the usual ones, then paused, said Dean's name. The journalist laughed. A reflex. Wayne didn't laugh. Looked at the journalist with the particular look that had intimidated studio executives for 30 years. "Dean Martin is tougher than anything I ever played," Wayne said. The journalist wrote it down but buried it in the piece. Seemed incongruous. Didn't fit the narrative. In 1974, the direct quote to the interviewer: "Dean Martin is a lot tougher than people think. I learned that the hard way. Still no explanation. Still protected. Nobody knew what had happened. They just knew something had." In 1976, a Hollywood event, a charity dinner. Wayne and Dean were both in attendance. Different tables, different circles. At some point in the evening, Wayne crossed the room, walked over to where Dean was sitting. They shook hands. Both said something. Private. Brief. Both laughed. A small laugh, the kind that acknowledges something shared. Something private. The people around them noticed but couldn't hear. Nobody knew what was said. Just that it was said. And that both men walked away from it with something lighter in their posture. Less weight, more ease. In 1979, John Wayne died. June 11th, lung cancer. The papers ran tributes. The eulogies covered his career, his characters, his impact. Among his personal papers, a note was found. No name on it, no context, no date. Just 3 words in Wayne's handwriting. That one surprised me. Nobody could say with certainty who it referred to. But people who knew the Durango story, who'd heard the fragments over the years, who'd followed the mystery, they had a very strong guess. The meaning of those 4 words grew over the years. As more people heard the story, as more people understood the context, as more people thought about what Dean had been facing that day and what he chose to do with it. There's a specific kind of courage in agreeing with your attackers. Most people understand courage as resistance, as fighting back, as refusing to accept negative judgments, standing up and saying, "You're wrong about me, I'll prove it." The counter-argument, the demonstration, the comeback. Dean Martin did something different. He said, "You might be right." And that was all. And in doing so, he demonstrated something that Wayne, who'd built his entire identity on a particular version of strength, had no framework to respond to. Because Wayne's version of strength required an opponent, required someone pushing back so he could push harder, required resistance so he could demonstrate what he was made of. Dean gave him none of that, agreed with the accusation, left Wayne with nothing to push against, nothing to overcome, nothing to prove, just a man who knew himself so completely that other people's definitions couldn't reach him. That's what those 4 words meant. Not cowardice, not concession, not defeat. Self-possession so absolute that the judgment of others had simply ceased to matter. Not as a performance, not as a strategy, as a way of living. The real measure of a person's security in themselves is not how they respond when praised. It's how they respond when attacked. When someone with real power, real credibility, real conviction says the worst thing they can say about you, some people crumble. Some people fight. Dean Martin looked at John Wayne, the Duke, the symbol, the genuine article, and said, "You're probably right," and moved on. October 1966. Durango, Mexico. 43 crew members sat at that lunch table. They watched John Wayne call Dean Martin a coward. They watched Dean Martin say 4 words. They watched Wayne sit back down, and every single one of them carried that moment for the rest of their lives. Not because they witnessed a fight, because they witnessed something rarer than a fight. They watched a man be so completely himself, so entirely comfortable with who he was, that the toughest insult from the toughest man in Hollywood just landed and died. Made no mark, left no wound, changed nothing, because Dan Martin already knew who he was, already knew his strengths, already knew his weaknesses, already knew his limits, and had made peace with all of it. John Wayne spent his entire career playing men who never showed weakness. Dean Martin spent his entire career being a man who never needed to hide it. One of them was performing strength. The other one was it. Real confidence doesn't need to defend itself. Real strength doesn't need to prove itself. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to someone trying to break you is simply, "I know I am." If you value stories like this, the moments that reveal who people really were when the cameras stopped rolling, there's an entire Dean Martin playlist waiting for you here.